Just a quick note before we get started. This episode of True Crime Conversations involves discussions of murder, alleged child abuse and sexual assault. An added note for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners, there will also be the naming of deceased Indigenous peoples and the recounting of events leading to their deaths. On the mid-north coast of New South Wales, there's a small town with a population of around 1,000 people. It's called Bowraville. It sits roughly halfway between Sydney and Brisbane. The summers are scorching, with buildings characterised by old-style verandas, providing shade in the sweltering heat. Within Bowraville is an Indigenous community known as the Mission, a stretch of only 8 brown brick houses. A woman named Muriel would come to know this strip better than just about anyone else, as she drove up and down it day after day, looking for her 16-year-old daughter Colleen. But Colleen wouldn't be the only child to vanish into thin air in this tiny community where everyone knew one another. 2 more young Indigenous kids would go missing in the months following her disappearance. So, why did it take almost 20 years for the community of Bowraville to finally have their voices heard? I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, investigating the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. The cases, the stories, and the people. In this episode, I'm speaking with Dan Box, author of Bowraville. Bowraville follows Dan's investigative work into the murders of 3 young Aboriginal kids, Colleen Walker, Evelyn Greenup, and Clinton Speedy Daru. So let's go back to a September night in 1990, and a young girl, she's 16, Colleen, goes to a party. Where was the party?
The party's on the Mission in Bowraville. So Bowraville is a small town, the mid-north coast of New South Wales. It's beautiful country, beautiful beaches, and then inland, this rolling green landscape. And Bowraville itself is a small, pretty town, pastel-coloured houses, wooden, weatherboard buildings. But just outside the town, there's the Aboriginal Mission, which is all strung along one road called Cemetery Road. And there's 8 at the time. There were 8 brick, single-storey houses in which the town's black population lived. And the town was very separated. You had a white population and you had a black population. And in the cemetery, which was just past the Mission, you had the white graves at the top of the hill and the black graves at the bottom of the hill. And the murders took place in and around the Mission. Colleen was staying in one of the houses, and she was last seen at a party in and outside that house. There was a fire outside, and she was last seen walking down one side of one of the buildings.
Was the Mission considered a generally safe place for people to be?
I've been there. It was perfectly safe. Other people might go there, and certainly I think the perception in the white part of the town was it was somewhere you didn't go. I remember talking to people in the town and they laughed about the idea of even going there at all. The 2 populations rarely met or rarely intermingled in that sense. The blackfellas weren't allowed to drink in one of the pubs. They had to drink in the stable out the back. The kids weren't allowed to go into the sweet shops and buy sweets or milkshakes in the town. It was a very segregated town. There was a lot... People told me there was a lot of hate in that town.
And when was Colleen, so she's gone to this party as sort of a young girl. What is known of her movements that night?
It's complicated. And this, I think, is the problem with this case. So when she disappeared, the police didn't take it seriously. Her mother reported her missing a couple of days later, and the police, she says, told her that maybe your daughter's gone walkabout. They just didn't really follow it up. So her mother was left to try and find Colleen herself, walking up and down the streets for weeks, trailing her children behind her, asking people if they had seen Colleen. And so you had all these confusing stories. Maybe she was here, maybe she was there. She was seen in that car. No, she was seen on the bus going up to Brisbane. But as best we know from the police work that's been done over the decades, she was at the party, she was in the building, she was outside around the fire, and then she was last seen walking down one side of the building where she was staying, and a white man was seen walking down the other side of the building. And it's possible that his car was parked behind the building, and she was never seen again.
So she's 16.
Yeah.
Was there any chance that she was the kind of girl that would, disappear or go off or, sort of go away for a few weeks and then come back? Was that part of her character?
Look, it's real life, and real life's complicated. So she was someone she'd left school. She was 16, she'd left school, she'd left home, she'd lived with family in Bowraville, she'd lived with family in Maxville, the next town down the river. She was at the beginning of her life, she was just enjoying her freedom, and she was making the most of that freedom. There was talk that she might have gone to one of the inland towns with some friends, she might have caught the train early in the morning. But I spoke to her mum, and her mum said that made no sense because Colleen would have told her if she was going there. Wherever Colleen went, she always kissed her mum goodbye, and she always came home.
So Colleen has disappeared, and then 2 weeks later there's another party that occurs in sort of the same road.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a bit about who Rebecca is? She was sort of part of the same community?
Yeah, so on the mission you had an Aboriginal community, so a lot of families, a lot of very tight families, and a lot of people who knew each other going back generations. Rebecca was a young mum at that time. She had a daughter, Evelyn, who was 4, and she had 2 young boys. And Rebecca, her family, she'd grown up in and around Bowraville. And that night at that party, she was there with Evelyn. She'd just come back to town. She took Evelyn and her young boys to the party. And her mum the party was at her mum's house. And look, there was a lot of drinking. There was a lot of carrying on. Rebecca was drinking, her mum was drinking. At one point they argued about whether the kids should even be there at the party. And the same white man who was last seen walking down the side of the house when Colleen disappeared, he was at the party. And he actually split up that argument between Rebecca and her mum about the kids. And then Rebecca went to sleep with her children in the room with her, in that house. Everybody goes to bed. But when Rebecca wakes up, Evelyn's gone.
So during the night, Patricia heard something strange, didn't she? Because she actually got up during the night to almost go and check on the children.
This only came out years later. And it only came out because one of the detectives who reinvestigated the case spent years and years getting to know the community, getting them to trust him. And the first few years of the investigation, the community didn't really trust the police, not in the same way. So what came out later was Patricia, Evelyn's grandmother. Everyone else had gone to sleep, but she's still awake that night, and she hears Evelyn crying. It's a 4-year-old girl. She hears her crying through the locked door, the shut door of the bedroom. She hears the crying, and then she hears a thud, and then there's silence. And later, another witness says that she saw that same white man walk out of the room and down the corridor and out of the building. Now, I've spoken to him. He disputes that he came out of the room, but he doesn't dispute that he was in the building at the time. So you have the child cry, a thud, and then silence, and then this man walks out.
And so did Patricia, the grandmother, just dismiss that sound at the time? She wasn't too worried about what was happening?
When she eventually told the police what had happened, she eventually trusted them enough to tell them. She broke down, she was crying. And she said, I should have done more. I heard her crying, I should have done more. And you can understand that because she knew then what had happened the next day. But that night she did nothing because her mum was in the room with Evelyn. But she didn't tell anyone about it for years. And when asked why she didn't tell anyone, she said that she was scared to because she felt guilty. And that had kind of eaten away at her. And also she was scared what other people in her community would say if she admitted that she'd heard Evelyn crying and then heard that thud. So she kept it to herself for years before finally telling the police.
And you wonder how someone can hurt something so perfect and sweet like that. Yeah, you know. She's a baby still.
So So they wake up the next morning and Evelyn is gone. Is there any evidence for where she might have been? Is there disruption in the room? Anything like that?
The only thing that we know is that one of her shoes is found outside the house. So that's the only trace of her, just a small pink sandal found outside the house. But there's a reason, or possibly a reason why we don't know anymore, which is, again, the police didn't respond in the way you'd think they would. They didn't say, a child's missing, this could be a murder. Hang on, this is the second child to go missing from the same street, in the same kind of circumstances, in the same town. At that point, you'd think that the police would flood Bowraville looking for potentially the child killer, but they don't. They treat her as a missing person. They move slowly. They say again to the family, if you ask the family, they say, maybe your kid's gone walkabout.
A 4-year-old?
A 4-year-old with one shoe missing. And so you have the same thing. The police are looking for a missing person. So you start hearing all these reports. Evelyn was there. Evelyn was there. She's at the waterhole. She's on the swing. She's at the shop. But these are all collected over weeks and months, and the dates are uncertain and people dispute them. It's almost like the police are chasing ghosts, but they're not treating it as a murder at this point. So Evelyn just disappears.
So they're not thinking that something sinister could have happened at all? Have they tied those two things together, or are they treating them as separate at this point?
They're treating them as separate, and more than that, they're disputing a connection. So if you go back and you read the reports at the time, the interviews with the police detectives at the time, they're specifically saying these cases are not related.
We were just disregarded and not listened to. We were just uneducated blacks on a mission.
So it's a few months later that a boy named Clinton comes. There's sort of a night where he goes out and he comes into contact with the same white man that has been present at the other two known last sightings. What happens to Clinton?
Clinton disappears. But Clinton disappears from that man's caravan. So it's another party. Again, there's drinking. Again, the man is present. And Clinton and Clinton's girlfriend go back to the man's caravan. They keep drinking. They fall asleep. When the man wakes up and goes to work a few hours later, Clinton isn't in the caravan. His girlfriend wakes up and finds his shoes outside the caravan. And she takes those shoes back to his parents and says, I just found Clinton's shoes, but he's not here. And at that moment, Clinton's father is terrified because Clinton never went anywhere without his shoes. It sounds silly, but Clinton he was 16, he was a young man. He cared about his appearance. He never took his shoes off unless he was in the shower or asleep, his parents told me. So when she turns up carrying his shoes, they're terrified. They don't know where he's gone. Clinton disappears, and still the police don't treat this as linked crimes. They treat him as a missing person, so they go out looking for Clinton, but they don't say, hang on, 1, 2, 3?
Same street.
Same street, same town, or similar circumstances. At this point, they're not looking for a serial killer. And then they find Clinton's body.
What sort of a young man was Clinton?
He was a very happy-go-lucky kid. He could walk around the football field on his hands. Like, he was a really strong boy, really fast runner. I think he was one of the fastest runners in school, in primary school. Good artist, good all-rounder, happy kid.
So in your book, you make a really good point that I think is pertinent here. There's hardly an Australian who wouldn't know the Beaumont children, and they went missing in 1966 on a beach in South Australia. Why is it that around that time, and in fact until personally I became familiar with your work, I had never heard of these Bowraville children? What's your theory as to why that's just been it's not been front of mind for Australians?
Probably because they're black, probably. The lead detective who reinvestigated this case, he spent more than 20 years of his life working on this case.
Is that Gary?
Gary Jubelin.
Yep.
And if he hadn't pursued it as hard as he did, I think the case would have been forgotten. But he gave evidence to a parliamentary inquiry into these murders, and he said it would be nice to believe that all victims are treated equally, but it's not true. And he said in this case, Race and poverty have played a factor into how the police responded and how the media respond. And I'll be honest, as a journalist, we know that when we go to certain crimes, if someone has been murdered, we know if that victim is a young white girl from a good family, did well at school, if she's pretty, if there's a good photo, we know that our bosses are going to care more. We know that might make it onto page one. We know if it's a black boy, ran away from home, wrong side of the tracks, no one's going to be that interested. And if we don't care, then are the police going to put as much resources into it? You'd like to say they would. You'd like to say all victims are treated equally. It's just not true.
These murders, 3 murders, they could have been solved, and they should have been solved. And for a variety of reasons, that hasn't occurred. Something that I've observed, because I've been involved in this since 1996 with the reinvestigation, and the family's frustration that they felt alone, that the authorities, whoever those people might be, didn't really care about their plight and their fight for justice. When they first told me that, I didn't really, well, be honest, I didn't believe them. I didn't think that would be the case. And they said people don't care. And unfortunately, working on it for almost 20 years now, I've seen that has actually played out.
I want to talk too about a story in your book where Muriel, it's a few days after Colleen has gone missing, I believe, and she dreams one night that something really bad has happened. What does she dream?
Muriel's Colleen's mum, and a few days after she says goodbye to Colleen, and at this point Colleen has left home to travel down to Bowraville. She's going to stay with family. There's a footy tournament. She's going to go to that and meet her mum at the tournament. And a few days after she leaves, Muriel has a dream that Colleen is being chased across a golf course between trees outside the Bowraville mission, and she's being chased by men. And Muriel can't see their faces. In her dream, she can just see their legs chasing after her daughter, and her daughter is crying out for help. And Muriel dreams that, and then she dreams that someone is digging a hole, and she looks at the hands of that person, and that person's hands are white. It's a dream. Muriel told me she still talks to Colleen today. Colleen's body's never been recovered. Her family still go out 27 years later. They still go out looking for her body. Muriel's brothers and sisters have grown up. They're adults. They still look for her body. Muriel's mum still talks to Colleen today.
They find Clinton's body.
Yeah.
What kind of evidence do they have about what might have happened to him?
2 main pieces of evidence. The first one is the wounds. He has evidence. He's pretty much a skeleton at this point. It's hot. It's the summer. It's bushland. There's wounds to his skull. He's had a massive blow which has shattered his jaw and a puncture wound in his skull. You don't know which of the 2 have killed him. Either possibly could have been the fatal blow. And also he's wearing shorts, and down the front of his shorts there's a stuffed up piece of material. And I spoke to the forensic detective who was called to the scene, and he looked at that material, and they pulled it out, and he opened it up, and it's a pillowcase. And he looked more closely, and it had a pattern of pink and purple overlapping circles, a little like, he said, a little like butterflies' wings. And he looked at that, and immediately he walked straight back up the hill, up to the road, got back in his car and drove as fast as he could back to Bowraville. And when he got there, he went back to the caravan where Clinton was last seen, because he knew, he'd been in that caravan before, and he knew the sheets there, the bed sheets, that same pattern of pink and purple circles that looked like little butterflies.
Why would that pillowcase be stuffed down his shorts? What would be the impetus for that?
All right. So now we're into the theoretical.
Yeah.
Can we explain it? There's 2 explanations I can give you. One of them is from the suspect himself, because I asked him this question. And he said, well, maybe Clinton took the pillowcase because he left my caravan and walked, it's about 7 kilometres, thereabouts, 5-7 kilometres, barefoot through the night, up into the hills, and he was using the pillowcase to collect marijuana, because there were some marijuana plants quite near where his body was found. And maybe that explains why he had it shoved down his shorts. And maybe it does. Another possible explanation is when you die suddenly, quite often lose control of your bowels and your bladder. And the forensic detective, Rob Hall, had said he's seen this in other cases. So if you die suddenly, you might lose control of your bladder. If that had happened, let's say, in the caravan where Clinton was asleep, it would have made a mess very quickly. Someone might have then grabbed a pillowcase that was to hand and shoved it down there just to soak up the mess. Maybe that's another reason why it's there. But what it is, whatever the reason, whatever the explanation, it's a link between Clinton's body and the caravan.
On the night Clinton Speedy disappeared, he was seen with a man. 2.5 weeks later, the teenager's body was found off a dirt track.
And the body had been placed or dumped more than anything underneath a bushy area directly off the track going down. We rolled the body over, and Clinton was wearing a pair of football shorts, and inside those football shorts was some fabric which I carefully removed and examined in situ, and noticed immediately that it reminded me of something. So I had a conversation with the homicide detectives about that, who had arrived that morning. Straight away, it reminded me of the caravan that I'd examined 3 weeks prior back at Barraville.
A few weeks later, I believe it is, they then find Evelyn's body.
Yeah.
Does there seem to be any connection in terms of the cause of death?
Yes. Yeah, there is. There's 2 things. Firstly, the bodies are both found next to the same road. There's a dirt track that runs through the forest above Barraville called the Congarini Road. Clinton's body is found on one side of that, just dragged into the bush or carried into the bush and dumped. No attempt to hide it. Evelyn's body is found further along the road, carried into the bush and dumped. No attempt to hide it. And the physical wounds, because again, she's a skeleton. There's a blow to the head that's fractured the skull, and there's a puncture wound to the head again. So the same kind of wounds, both times.
And is anything found of Colleen?
Yes. If you drive further along the Congarini Road, so you leave Barraville, you go through the hills a little way, not far, and turn up onto the dirt track Congarini Road. You go past where Evelyn was found. You go past where Clinton was found. You keep driving. You end up going over a river. The bridge goes over the river, and just there, just downstream of there, they found Colleen's clothes in bags, weighted down with stones.
So surely at this point, the police have got to be making a connection. They've found these, 2 bodies and also evidence that a third could be in the vicinity. Are they now treating this as really serious?
Yeah, at this point, yes. At this point. And they find Clinton's body. It's suddenly they've got 1 murder, but still 2 missing persons. They find Evelyn's, and the forensic detective, Rob Hall, he's told me how just then that creeping fear at the back of his head just completely took over. Now they're dealing with a serial killer. And at this point they've got 3 murders. Who's responsible? They have to find him, because a serial killer is on the loose.
And what do they know about that man who was in the caravan, who had the pillowcase? What do they know about the type of person he was and what role he might have played in that community?
Because Barraville's so small, they know quite a lot about him. And they pick him up very, very quickly. And to give him his credit, he agrees to come. He agrees to be interviewed. They pick him up for the first time, I think the day after Clinton's body is found. And they interview him, but they let him go. They pick him up again. They interview him. They let him go. It happens again. They speak to him. They let him go. He's a big man. He's tall. He's broad. He's in his 20s. He's a tough guy. He works in the local tannery. His job is hauling hides around to make leather. So it's a bloody, messy job. He's well known. His family live in this town. His family still live there. In fact, the town is so small, his family and the family of the victims of this crime, they see each other every day. They cross in the street.
And is he a white man? Is he on
He's
that?
white.
Did he have much to do with the Aboriginal community there?
Yeah, and that's unusual in Barraville. The 2 communities didn't mix. He was unusual. He went down to the community. He lived there for a while. This man, the man they interview following the deaths, actually had a relationship with Colleen's aunt and had a child with her. So he lived on the mission. Colleen would have called him uncle. And that's really unusual. He had sexual relationships with a number of women on that mission. And according to different pieces of evidence that have been heard at different times, he had a sexual interest in Colleen, and he also had a sexual interest in Evelyn's mum. And where this case takes a turn, I mean, you're talking about murders, but where it takes a turn for the worst is there's also an element of potential sexual assault. The police believe that, well, Colleen was a 16-year-old girl. We don't know what happened to her, but we know her clothes were taken off. Evelyn, the 4-year-old, disappears from a room where her mum's sleeping. When her mum wakes up, her trousers have been removed. Clinton, the 16-year-old boy, disappears from a caravan where his girlfriend is sleeping. When she wakes up, her trousers have also been removed. So you're looking at murders. You're also potentially looking at sexual assaults.
Is there any implication? Because you'd think that if someone was trying to remove your clothing, you'd wake up. And these women didn't wake up, did they, until the next morning?
No.
So is there any sort of theory as to why that might have been?
There's a lot of drinking. I mean, those parties on the mission, they drank hard. Also, there were allegations, and none of this has been proved. There are allegations that this white man, the man we're talking about, the man the police suspected, that he'd put pills, he was seen putting pills into people's drinks. And Rebecca's told me that when she fell asleep that night, it was like nothing she'd felt before. She was completely out of it. And when she woke up, even though Evelyn was missing, she went back to sleep. I've spoken to people who met her that day, and they couldn't understand her reaction. We don't know what happened. There's no forensic evidence. So much of what might be evidence was not collected at the time.
You know, he provided the alcohol and drugs, and he was known to spike people's drinks. He was a predator. You know, he was a sexual predator, and he liked the young girls.
There's these three what appear to be murders, and there's a clear suspect who is at the last known site. At what point is he arrested and seriously considered as perhaps the person who did this?
There's an interview between the police at the time. They interview him more than once, and he's always voluntarily interviewed, and they keep letting him go. And then after 1, 2, 3 times, they show him the picture of the pillowcase, the one that was found down Clinton's shorts, and they say, "Do you recognise this?" And he denies it. Then they arrest him, and they charge him with murder. They charge him with 2 of the murders, ultimately, Clinton's and Evelyn's, because Colleen's body's never been found. He denies them. And also, they ask him specifically about Clinton's murder. Then they arrest him. And afterwards, there's a record of a conversation, a police conversation, where somebody says to him, "Do you also want to talk about Evelyn's death?" And he says, "No, I've said too much already." And then he's charged.
So he then goes to court.
Yeah.
You'd think that there is, some compelling evidence. Is it enough?
Well, this is where the case gets complicated. If you thought it was complicated now, when it gets into court, it acquires a whole new dimension of unreality almost due to the complexity involved. So we're talking now, this is still a long time ago, 25 years, round figures. It gets to court, and this man has been charged with 2 murders, the murder of Clinton and the murder of Evelyn. But the judge at the time says, we're going to separate these trials. So the jury is not going to hear that 2 children were murdered.
Why is that? Why is that decision made?
In the law at the time, and the law has changed since, it's the right decision. I've spoken to lawyers and I've said, this decision seems bizarre because you've got 3 kids, the same town, the same time period, all 3 seen at parties. It seems obvious you'd collect them together, but the law said, unless the evidence clearly demonstrates that the same person committed all 3, we're not going to hear it together because it's prejudicial for that person. It's only fair, according to the law, that we hear the evidence about each alleged crime separately. So each jury is only told 1 person disappeared from that town. The jury have no idea that it was actually 3 people at the same town in what looks like the same way.
Which seems to be the most compelling detail, really.
To you and me, it seems... And to the police, subsequently, they argued, absolutely, it's the similarities between the cases that let you understand how they were committed. But the law at the time said it's not fair to the accused to present it in that way. The law has changed since. This kind of evidence is still difficult in court because it can make you think, well, he must have done it, that person must have done it. I think now the decision might have been made differently. This case could be completely different if heard today.
So basically, because they're not privy to all of the information, and also I guess because the evidence that it wasn't considered compelling enough by the jury, he's declared not guilty. Is that correct? He's
declared not guilty both of killing Clinton and separately of killing Evelyn. Why? A big part of it may have been that the jurors only heard about one death at a time, but another part of it, a really important part, is the jury are told that when the police treated these as missing persons investigations, they heard, witnesses told them that each of the victims was seen alive after the time of death. But the police have subsequently said they don't trust all those interviews because they were conducted later, or they're contradictory, or the people who said that actually weren't in the town at the time they said that.
Why would people say that? Is there any theory?
Memory's a tricky thing. You think memories, you could trust them. You or I, you'd think if we were asked to give evidence in court about something that happened, say, last week, we'd just remember it. But do you remember what you had for lunch on Thursday last week?
No.
No idea. And even on, lunch is a flippant thing, but okay, take one of the cops I spoke to who was involved in the initial investigation. He said missing persons investigations are different to murder investigations for a really good reason, because you can't trust people's memories. They play tricks. So missing persons investigations, the police will go door to door and they'll say, did you see a 4-year-old girl who looked like this? And they'll often have a photograph. Did you see this girl? In a murder investigation, the police will go door to door and say, what were you doing on Thursday and what did you see? And then they will join the dots. Because if I show you a photograph, have you seen this girl? Your mind starts playing tricks and starts to think, yeah, I have seen that girl. Or someone who looked just like her. She was over there. She was at this place. And so you start getting distorted or coloured memories, or the possibility for distorted or coloured memories. And the police say that's what's happened in this case. That you've had these witness sightings after these children may have died that are actually false witness sightings. The suspect's legal team say they're accurate witness sightings, because if these kids were seen alive after the date the police say they were killed, then they can't have disappeared at those parties. And it doesn't matter that this white man was seen at each of those parties. And it's almost like the police were chasing ghosts. And that has been a problem running through the whole investigation.
Would it be different if we were white? I can't help but ask. Would we have a different situation today?
What was the effect on the Bowraville community in the wake of this? Did it change the way parents raised their kids? Did it change their sense of safety?
It's had a huge impact on that town. Remember, it's a small, small town. When I went there a quarter century after the murders happened, it felt like the town had been unable to move forwards. Remember, the families of the victims and the suspect live together. They see each other. They live on the same street, some of them. People told me that the town had a lot of hate in it, that every time the murders were in the news, whenever they were covered, there'd be aggression, there'd be violence in the town. Certainly when his trial, the suspect was found not guilty, some of the people from the mission marched into town. They broke windows at the suspect's mother's house. They formed an angry crowd outside the police station. They demanded justice. There was a lot of hate, a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, and that was still very much alive at the time that I visited there a quarter century later.
What opportunities did they have following on from that not guilty verdict? What could they do next?
Well, that's the problem. That's the great problem. So the detectives who were leading the investigation at that point, it was a new team. They met with the children's family after the second case, the second not guilty verdict. And the family said to them, well, what do we do now? And the detectives said, well, there's nothing you can do because there's a law called double jeopardy. And it basically says if you're found not guilty of a serious crime, that's it, you can't be tried again. And the reason is it stops, the police punishing people unfairly. The police get one shot, they give their best evidence, and it stops them picking up someone they don't like and charging him again and again and again. So the families were told there's nothing you can do unless, I guess, if you want to overturn double jeopardy. Now, this is a law that goes back to the Greeks and the Romans. It's one of the most important principles in our legal system. And the families said, all right, we'll overturn it. We will change this law. And they did.
When did they actually change that? How do you go about changing a law?
You write a lot of letters, it turns out. So one of the family members is this incredible lady called Leonie Giroux. She's in Clinton's family. She married Clinton's brother. And she's got boxes and boxes and boxes of letters that she sent to politicians, that she sent to the Attorney General, that she sent to the Governor General, that she sent to the police. And they went unanswered. So she sent them again. She wrote to every member of the New South Wales Parliament twice, just to get them talking about this. And it came at a time when the law on double jeopardy had just been changed in the UK because of a similar case. And politicians here were starting to think, maybe we need to look at this. And then the Bowraville families turn up. The families of 3 Aboriginal kids from a tiny town in the back of New South Wales, and they demanded something were done. And they went to meet their MP, and he took them to meet the Premier's office. And the law got changed.
So they've changed the law. Are they able to put him on the stand again?
No, because nothing's easy.
Yeah.
Nothing's easy and nothing seems fair if you're the families of these murdered kids. Because the law gets changed, but it only gets changed so far. They don't say, right, well, actually, you know what? If you've got evidence, you can send these guys to trial again. The law says, firstly, you have to have fresh and compelling evidence.
So is that like, say, DNA evidence or something?
That would be the classic.
Yeah.
So DNA evidence didn't exist at the time that these murders happened. You go back, you retest something, and you find someone's DNA. Bang, you're back in court. But also, you have to get permission from a politician, really, to send it back to court. The only 2 people who can send it back to court are the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Attorney General. So the police and the families have to go to these 2 people, these men, and say, will you send it back to court? The police say they've got fresh evidence. They've spoken to new witnesses. They've been told things that the original police weren't told at the time. They say they've got enough to send this back to court. But it's a politician who decides whether the court will look at it. And the politicians say no. So they go to the DPP, they go to the Attorney General, they go to the next Attorney General. Every single one of them says no, but they keep trying.
Why do you think they're saying no? Is it because they don't think that it's going to end in a conviction?
It's difficult to know because these people refuse to be interviewed.
Right.
Funnily enough, at one point the DPP said he thought the evidence was fresh but not compelling. And at one point, one of the Attorney Generals thought the evidence was compelling but not fresh.
Interesting.
So they're basically saying, we don't think this will go to a conviction. Therefore, we're not going to let the courts decide. When I looked at it, and I'm no expert, and that's probably why I didn't think the same thing they thought, I thought, well, you've never heard evidence about all 3 of these murders at the same time. Why don't you let the courts decide? Give them that evidence and let the courts decide. But what you've got is politicians saying, we're not going to let the courts decide. That always struck me as wrong.
Yeah, that's not how you imagine from the outside that the court proceedings work.
No.
This has been an extraordinary effort by this community and this family who took on a legal system and overturned the rule of double jeopardy that has been entrenched in the legal system for 800 years. They did that when the Parliament overturned that law and introduced the legislation to allow retries in double jeopardy situations. They mentioned the Bowraville case specifically. They overturned that law so these cases could get back into court. And so then to have to try and explain to the families, the community, to the broader Aboriginal community that you now have this law, but the Attorney Generals now twice have decided not to take that extra step and bring these cases into court is quite difficult to explain.
So what happens with Colleen? Is there any sort of inquest into how she died or what happened to her?
Well, this is where the police got really clever. And so the lead detective is a guy called Gary Jubelin. And he's been on this case for years. He's been running up against brick walls. He's been trying to get it sent back to court. The DPP has said, I'm not going to send it back to court. Gary Jubelin then thinks, well, okay, why don't we go and talk to the coroner? So a state coroner is someone who investigates a death. It's not their job to find anyone innocent or guilty. It's their job to say, what are the circumstances of a death? So Gary goes to talk to the coroner and he says, at this point, you've got Evelyn, no one has been found guilty of her murder, and you've got Colleen, and we don't know what happened to her because her body's not been found. He asks the coroner to investigate. The coroner holds an inquest, investigates the killing. The suspect we've been talking about, this white man, refuses to give evidence. Lots of other people in Barryville do give evidence. The coroner comes back and says, I find that both of these children were murdered, and there is evidence to prosecute one person. It doesn't say who, one person for the murder. And he asks the DPP to reconsider that decision. And at that point, that's when you get a trial for Evelyn's murder. The DPP at that point overturns a previous decision.
And so that trial for Evelyn's murder, when did that happen?
2004. So at this point, it is confusing. You've got a trial for Clinton's murder in the mid-90s, found not guilty. At that point, they drop the charge over Evelyn's murder. Gary asks the DPP to charge the same man over Evelyn's murder, declines, goes to the inquest. The inquest asks the DPP to charge that same person over Evelyn's murder, says, okay, let's do it. Still found not guilty because the trials are still being held separate.
So all those years later, they still can't say this man has stood in court for a murder that happened a few months later?
No.
Wow.
You can see the sense in it, in that if you send a man to trial for murder and you tell the jury, you know what, this same bloke was actually put on charge for another murder.
When the court technically found him not guilty.
Yeah, you still can't say it.
That's incredible. So then he's found not guilty of that. What after that? So we're in 2004.
Yeah.
What does the family then do?
That's when they try and overturn double jeopardy.
Right.
And then they get that done. And then you're in a position where the man has been found not guilty twice, and they campaign to have that overturned, and then they go to the politicians, and the politicians say no. And then they keep going to the politicians. And that was the point when Gary asked to meet me. So I was a newspaper reporter at the time. And he said, you should look at this case.
And that's unusual, isn't it, for a detective to come to you with a case?
Yeah, that doesn't happen.
And did you know much about the case?
No.
And what exactly did he want you to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's probably the first thing I should have asked Gary. If I'm honest, I think Gary wanted me to pick up the case and put it in the newspaper because, and this is, he didn't say this, I could be wrong, because if it's in the newspaper, if we're putting it on the front page, say, then his bosses are going to devote more resources to that investigation, which at this point has been going on for decades and isn't getting a lot of attention from the police. If it's in the paper, it gets more attention. Maybe he gets more resources. Maybe he gets a chance to change it. Maybe if it's in the paper, the politicians will change their mind and send it back to court. So Gary's wanting to use me at this point. As far as I'm concerned, it's 3 dead kids. You should look at this.
Is that what happens? Does it put more pressure, do you feel, on the police and on prosecutors?
A whole lot of things came together at the same point. So we did some stuff in the paper, we did a podcast, and in the podcast you can hear the family's voices.
And that was in 2016?
Yeah. This has rolled on for a long time at this point. What's changed, though, is you can hear the families in the podcast. So I wrote some things for the newspaper, and no one really paid any attention. Another guy working for a different newspaper, he asked me, why are you bothering? This case is old, it's cold, it's not going anywhere. But then I made a podcast, and in it you can hear, say, Evelyn's aunt standing there looking at the place where her niece's body was discovered, talking about how they drove past it over and over again, and it was lying there alone. And you can hear she's trying not to cry. She's trying to hold herself together. And in a podcast, you can hear all of that. And when people started to hear the families describe their story in their words, it felt like something changed. People started to sit up and listen to what was going on. And then the families kept campaigning. They protested outside Parliament. There was pressure coming from within Parliament. There was pressure from the police, who sent another submission to the 3rd Attorney General saying, can we send this back to court? All of those things came at the same time, and the Attorney General changed her mind. She overruled her predecessor's decision. She said, yes, now, this time, we're going to let the courts decide.
And what happened?
It went to court. It went to the appeal court. The appeal court has the power to overturn a not guilty verdict. This had never been done before. It's the first time anyone's tried to say a man has been found not guilty of murder. We're going to overturn that and start the whole trial again. You had the most senior judge in the state, the Chief Justice, was one of 3 judges who'd make their minds up. No jury, just judges. You had incredible teams of lawyers who went through the evidence, spent months and months preparing, who fought it out, and it was a fight in that courtroom. The judges went away for 9 months, and they came back on the anniversary of the day that Colleen disappeared. All the families are in that court. Colleen's mum's there. Colleen's dad's there. It's the first time he's ever been in court because there hasn't been a previous trial about his daughter's death. Evelyn's mum's there. Clinton's mum and dad are there. All of them are waiting and watching these judges. The judges come back. One of them looks like she's close to tears. And the judges say, we're not going to hear this case. Or rather, we're not going to overturn this case. But they don't say, we've looked at all the evidence and the evidence isn't good enough to overturn this case. What they say, they actually say we don't need to look at the evidence. They say that, do you remember I said to overturn double jeopardy, you have to have fresh and compelling evidence? They say, look, this word fresh, let's look at what that word means. Evidence is fresh if it's been adduced in court before. Adduced is a legal term. I'd never heard it before. No one was quite sure what adduced meant. So you had the lawyers arguing that this man should go back to court saying adduced meant one thing. The lawyers arguing saying he shouldn't go back to court saying adduced meant something different. The court decided what adduced meant. And on their definition, the evidence wasn't fresh. They could have defined it differently and the evidence might have been fresh. But on their definition, it wasn't fresh. Therefore, they didn't need to look at the evidence because it wasn't fresh. Therefore, they could not turn this case over. The man remains not guilty.
I admire the tenacity of the community, the spirit that says that we're not going to, this doesn't end until we get the justice that we know these children deserve. And for people to say, get over it, it smacks. We know how racist this country is, and it just always smacks to me of the depth of racism and the depth of callousness, the lack of feeling, the lack of sympathy, lack of empathy for what our people have endured as a people for 200 years. And this is just like a microcosm of that.
So we're now in 2019.
Yeah.
Your book has just been released.
Yeah.
Where are we at? What are the opportunities? Where is the family at?
Oh, that's a long answer. The families are some of the most impressive people you could hope to meet. We're in this strange place. You'll notice I've never used the suspect's name. There's a reason I've never used the suspect's name, because this case went to the appeal court. They said no. It then went to the High Court, the highest court in Australia. They said, we're not going to change the appeal court's decision. Fresh means this, adduced means that, it stands. No one's looked at the evidence. You still have never had a jury hear evidence about all 3 cases together. After that, a court says, we're going to put a non-publication order on this man's name. Part of the reason, so I can't say his name now, you can't say his name. Part of the reason the court says is to protect him from the families of the children. The thing is, the families of the children know who he is. They know where he lives. It's been over a quarter of a century. They've never tried to hurt him. No one has ever decided we're going to take justice into our own hands. They have always put their faith in the police and the courts and done the right thing every single time. And it's got them to where they are, which is their children have been killed. Whoever killed them is still walking free today. The families hope that the double jeopardy law could be changed again, and there is an attempt in Parliament now to change it. That could happen. But the families know that probably it's not going to be enough to send this case back to court. I spoke to Evelyn's aunt recently, and she told me that their best hope now is that another family doesn't go through the same thing they've been through over the years.
So finally, I have to ask you what your hope is. What's your hope that could, potentially happen in the next few years?
I was talking last night to one of the police who's been working on the reinvestigation, has spent God knows how many years, God knows how many hours. Most of the detectives who've worked on this case have suffered PTSD or marital breakdowns. They've taken their work home. I've seen tough cops in tears over this case because they haven't been able to solve it. I was talking to one of them last night, and the only thing, and it's such a rare hope, the only thing would go back to what you were saying about DNA. If Colleen's body was found and there was something with it, a piece of clothing, a piece of hair, somehow that had survived years and years of being buried, if she's buried, that had some DNA, then you might be able to charge someone over that murder. It's a rare hope.
Is it possible that the suspect could just confess?
If the suspect did it, and he's been found not guilty, and he told me he didn't do it, so there's no reason to believe that that person will confess. He's been found not guilty twice. It's effectively been upheld by the highest court in the country. I've spoken to him more than once. I've met him physically every time he's told me he didn't do it. If somebody confessed, that could be enough. But it's going to take that or the DNA or something as remarkable, I think, at this point. And I really hate saying that.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, and thank you for all the work you have done on this case, because it's such an important one, and it's one that, you make such a good point that for so long it wasn't at the front of our minds, and it needs to be.
Thank you.
I have a look at this. I've followed this case since it started. I have a look at this, and for the life of me, I can't figure out why 3 kids in one street can be murdered and you can't bring the perpetrator to justice. I can come up with my own conclusions. They're not healthy conclusions. And unless the government digs down and finds the entire truth, not only just of the murderers, but who mishandled the investigations and why they mishandled it, these questions will be continued to be asked. If this happened to 3 white kids in any street in Australia, all hell would break loose. The media would be all over it like measles. Current affair programs would not stop. There would be royal commissions. We've got a quarter of a century and this community is still asking questions, and they're the brave ones. It's bravery versus cowardice. Bravery has honesty, cowardice is full of deceit.
Dan Box's book, Bowraville, is out now online and at all good bookstores. The theme for NAIDOC Week for 2019 is Voice, Treaty, Truth. If you have any information that can help the families of the Bowraville victims find the truth about what happened to Colleen Walker, Evelyn Greenup and Clinton Speedy Daru, please call Crime Stoppers on 1800 333 000. If this episode has raised any issues for you, please call Lifeline on 13 11 14. You can join the True Crime Conversations Facebook group by following the links in the description of this episode. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and produced by Elise Cooper.